101 is a slang term for the most basic knowledge in some subject.
101, like our podcast.
This is Venezuela 101.
Hey everyone, I'm Melanio Escobar.
And I'm Miguel Pizarro.
And this is Venezuela 101.
Usually, our episodes air on Thursdays every 2 weeks. However, today we have decided to publish our first special episode.
On this episode, we will listen to two guests quoting some relevant points from the report of the independent fact-finding mission for the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This mission was established by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in September 2019 in order to evaluate alleged human rights violations committed in Venezuela since 2014.
On September 20, the mission published their third report. In this one, they speak about two important topics. First, all the crimes against humanity committed through the structure and individuals belonging to the state intelligence and counterintelligence service as part of a plan to repress people who oppose the government. And second, the human rights situation in the Arco Minero del Orinoco region and in other areas of the Bolivarian state and the mining activity in Venezuela.
The fact-finding mission stated that this report is intended to continue to draw attention on the ongoing human rights crisis in the country, fueled by the collapse of the state's institution while highlighting situations and groups that are constantly forgotten, including the indigenous populations. So, from now on, stay with us to hear some detailed findings and conclusions.
The mission presented its first report to the Human Rights Council on September 25, 2020, which focused on human rights violations and crimes in the context of targeted political repression, security operations, and protests. The mission concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that some of the events documented in that report amounted to crimes against humanity. The report further included the mission's initial assessment of responsibilities for the violations and crimes identified.
The mission remains concerned about continued allegations of gross violation of human rights in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela as a whole, including number 1, acts of torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, including sexual and gender-based violence by state law enforcement and intelligence services, consistent with previously identified patterns and detention conditions amounting to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment against real or perceived opponents of the government and their families, or other individuals associated with them, including indigenous persons. Number 2, killings consistent with previously documented patterns of extrajudicial executions and other violations in the context of security operations in low-income urban neighborhoods in various parts of the country. These require more in-depth investigation, but available information indicates that such killings have continued at a worrying level. Number 3, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, forced labor, and sexual exploitation, including sexual slavery and trafficking in persons in borders and remote areas. The mission remains particularly concerned about the situation in the states of Amazonas and Delta Macuro, in particular regarding alleged violations against indigenous peoples. And number 4, continued persecution, intimidation, and arbitrary detentions targeting media workers, civil society organizations, human rights defenders, and lawyers.
The mission conducted interviews with 246 individuals during the present cycle, involving 140 men and 106 women, both in person and remotely, via secure telephone or video connections. Given the lack of authorization to carry out investigations in the territory of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, the mission's secretariat team conducted 2 missions to areas near its border. The mission's 3 experts, furthermore, visited border areas in July 2022. In addition, the mission included information from interviews conducted during previous investigations. 383 interviews involving 216 men and 167 women, whenever relevant.
In its 2020 report, the mission concluded with reasonable grounds to believe that violations and crimes committed in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela were part of a widespread and systematic attack directed against a civilian population in the context of a policy to suppress opposition to the government. The mission identified 6 main perpetrator structures in the commission of human rights violations and crimes falling within the mission's mandate. Among these structures were Venezuela's state military and civilian intelligence services, the Directorate General of Military Counterintelligence, DGCIM, and the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, SEBIN, respectively. The mission concluded in 2020 that individuals at a different institutional and hierarchical level in the two bodies were involved in those violations and crimes, with a view to suppress real and perceived opposition to the government.
The following report expands on the mission's findings from 2020 and 2021 to focus on the roles of the SEBIN and the DGCIM as institutions, as well as of specific individuals in said violations and crimes. The report presents a deeper understanding of these structures and the roles and contributions by those at different levels in the chain of command, with the objective of advancing determinations of responsibility. The crimes and violations committed by members of the SEBIN and the DGCIM, which, as noted in the mission's 2020 report, amounted to crimes against humanity, were of particular cruelty and committed against individuals who were defenseless. Real and perceived government opponents and their family members were subjected to illegal detention, followed by acts of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, and sexual and gender-based violence.
Nevertheless, the structures of DGCIM and SEBIN remain the same to date, and the patterns of conduct within these agencies, as previously documented by the mission, still persist. Various individuals suspected of crimes and violations continue to work at relevant positions within the Bolivarian National Armed Force, FAMP, and the Bolivarian National Police, BNB, some of whom obtained promotions in 2022.
The mission investigated the case of 122 current and former Bolivarian National Armed Forces officers and civilians associated with them, who were arrested, detained, and tortured by the DGCIM between February 12, 2014 and the present. The peak periods of detention in the DGCIM's Boleita were 2017, 2018, and 2019. The DGCIM gathers information on targets through tips, military sources, a network of informants, the infiltration of opposition sectors, or telephone and digital surveillance, often without any court order.
The mission has documented numerous irregularities during arrests carried out by DGCIM. These include a failure to present warrants or arrests based on false evidence. The mission has documented several cases where DGCIM used excessive force during arrests, including the shooting of arrestees. Another frequent tactic of DGCIM was to arrest or orchestrate kidnappings of family members to pressure targets to turn themselves in. According to former DGCIM employees and other sources, DGCIM routinely plants or manipulates evidence to falsely frame targets. Tactics include planting weapons or political propaganda in the homes of targets, or the use of torture to pressure detainees to make false accusations. DGCIM makes extensive use of telephonic and digital surveillance and often manipulated recordings to frame targets.
Former detainees who were held in Boleita described being subjected to extremely harsh detention conditions. Cells lack natural light, while time outside and access to sanitary facilities is heavily restricted. Prisoners described having to defecate into plastic bags or bottles and being forced to eat food from the floor. Apart from its detention cells in Boleita, the DGCIM relies on a network of covert detention centers throughout the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, where detainees are brought to be interrogated and subjected to torture and sexual violence.
The mission has documented 122 cases of victims who were subjected to torture, sexual violence, and/or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment perpetrated by the DGCIM agents between 2014 and to present. Acts of torture were carried out to extract an alleged confession, obtain information, punish, intimidate, humiliate, or coerce, and in some cases to steal money or other assets. Torture sessions could last for days or weeks. Detainees were generally tortured during interrogations shortly after arrest, but some detainees were also tortured during late periods of detention. DHESIM relied on a range of torture methods, including heavy beatings with objects, electric shocks, asphyxiation with plastic bags, and stress positions, as well as psychological tortures such as white torture. The sessions could result in serious and/or permanent physical injury, as well as severe psychological trauma and depression. The mission has documented cases of loss of sensory or motor functions, reproductive injuries, and at least one miscarried pregnancy as a result of acts of torture inflicted by the DHESIM agents.
The mission has reasonable grounds to believe that 6 individuals whose acts and conduct have been set out in the mission's detailed findings may bear criminal responsibility for the events described in this report and should be investigated. The identities of some of these individuals at the line director's level and above have been spelled out in the accompanying conference room paper.
The information received shows that persons at low and mid levels of the DHESIM were involved in the execution of crimes and violations. At higher levels of responsibility within the DHESIM, officials issued orders and had knowledge of crimes and violations being committed. The mission found reasonable grounds to believe that 2 individuals working at a low to mid levels of responsibility within the DHESIM's Boleita were implicated in acts of torture, including sexual violence, either directly or indirectly. Multiple witnesses, including victims, provided statements and other materials to the mission in support of the allegations against these individuals. For instance, at least 10 former detainees pointed to direct participation of one of these officials in acts of torture. Testimony from these victims is consistent with the patterns of torture and other human rights violations documented by the mission. Accordingly, these identified individuals have beaten multiple detainees, including with objects like a bat and a table, asphyxiated detainees with plastic bags or grenade smoke, applied the señorita, a torture device to lower bodies into water tanks, applied electric shocks against detainees, including to the detainees' testicles, committed acts of sexual violence, including raping detainees with wooden sticks, threatened detainees to rape and kill members of their families if they did not provide certain information, put pins inside the fingernails of detainees, instructed lower-ranking DHESIM officials to carry out acts of torture, and participating in operations whereby family members of targeted individuals were detained in order to pressure targets to surrender.
As noted above, the Special Directorate of Criminal and Criminalistics Investigations was implicated in a range of human rights violations, including torture, sexual violence, arbitrary arrests, and short-term enforced disappearances. The directors participated in the violations directly, committed through their subordinates and/or ordered subordinates to torture detainees. At a similar level of hierarchy within the DHESIM, the mission received information about crimes and human rights violations within the Special Affairs Directorate. According to consistent information received by the mission, its director ordered, supervised, and directly participated in arrests, arbitrary detentions, short-term enforced disappearances, torture, including sexual violence and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment.
DHESIM's highest level authority, the Director General, has direct command over all line directorates, including DAE and DIPC, which, as noted above, have been implicated in a range of crimes and human rights violations. The Director General is closely involved in DHESIM's operational decisions. He has command and control over his subordinates and is aware of what takes place in Boleita. He is responsible for violations carried out by his subordinates. The mission received information that the Director General, in turn, receives orders directly from the President, including targets for arrest, although these are not transmitted in writing to avoid paper trail. While the Director General rarely participates in operations or interrogations directly, the mission received information about some instances where he has played a direct role, particularly in high-profile cases.
The mission investigated cases involving more than 90 victims in which the SEBIN arrested, detained, and subjected individuals to torture and other serious human rights violations and crimes between 2014 and present. The peak periods of detention in the SEBIN's El Helicoide were in 2016, 2017, and 2018. Orders identifying targets for investigation came directly from President Maduro and at times from Diosdado Cabello via the SEBIN Director General. He, in turn, passed instructions to subordinates, in particular the Directorates of Strategic Investigations and of Immediate Actions. The principal SEBIN targets were civilians, real or perceived government opponents, and high-profile critics. These included opposition politicians, journalists, student and protest leaders, and individuals working for non-governmental organizations.
SEBIN arrests were carried out after a period of surveillance and investigation. According to a former SEBIN agent, surveillance was always carried out on direct orders of the Director General. SEBIN used various methods to monitor targets, including phone tapping, physical bugging of rooms, and hidden cameras. Higher profile targets, such as opposition politicians, were monitored for longer periods, while SEBIN would on occasion provide several daily updates to President Maduro on their movements. The mission has documented numerous irregularities during arrests by SEBIN. Agents systematically alleged individuals were arrested in flagrante delicto to justify warrantless arrests. SEBIN rarely relied on warrants or informed targets of the reasons of their arrest. In several cases, agents used excessive force or violence and systematically planted evidence, such as weapons or contraband, on targets to frame them.
Once arrested, it was common practice for the SEBIN to hold detainees incommunicado for hours, days, or weeks, sometimes amounting to short-term enforced disappearances. A former SEBIN agent told the mission that the SEBIN also maintained covert detention centers in every state in the country. SEBIN agents would routinely interrogate detainees without lawyers present and refused to grant detainees requests to speak to legal representatives. Several detainees were forced under duress to sign or film statements incriminating themselves in crimes they had not committed. The mission has documented that the SEBIN made frequent use of extortion against targets before or after arrest and would raid targets' houses to steal money and valuables. This would often be done by lower-level employees to significantly increase their meager salaries. In one case, one individual was extorted by the SEBIN for hundreds of thousands of dollars after 30 agents appeared at his place of business, accusing him of storing drugs there.
The mission's investigation focused on El Helicoide, a 1950s-era building originally built as a shopping center in central Caracas. It houses both administrative offices and detention cells, but lacks the basic facilities for hygiene, sanitation, and recreation to function as a prison. SEBIN occupies 2 floors of the building, with the lower floor hosting most detention cells, including cells specifically used to punish and torture detainees. Former detainees describe detention conditions as dire, with cells frequently overcrowded well past their capacity. Cells mostly lacked natural light and water, and since prisoners were only allowed 1 daily bathroom visit, many had to urinate in plastic bottles. The conditions disproportionately affected female detainees, in particular during menstruation. There were, however, privileged cells with better conditions where detainees had to pay to be kept. Visits of family members were highly restricted, while meetings with lawyers were at times monitored by SEBIN guards or recorded. Several former SEBIN employees recounted that release orders by judges were often ignored and that prisoners would be released and detained arbitrarily based on political decisions.
The mission investigated 51 cases in which SEBIN agents tortured or subjected detainees to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Some torture sessions would last for days or weeks. The torture and ill treatment was usually carried out within the first few days of detention, prior to initial court appearances, while the detainee was held incommunicado. The acts were usually committed during interrogations to extract confessions or information including phone and social media passwords, or to enforce individuals to incriminate themselves or others, particularly high-profile opposition leaders. Former SEBIN employees said that torture was ordered directly by President Maduro, by line directors, or by the Director General. The SEBIN relied on a range of torture methods, including beatings, electric shocks, asphyxiation with plastic bags, and stress positions, as well as threats to kill and rape detainees or other forms of psychological torture. In at least 7 cases reviewed by the mission, SEBIN agents perpetrated acts of sexual or gender-based violence against detainees in an attempt to elicit confessions or information implicating others, or to degrade, humiliate, or punish them. During interrogation, SEBIN officials threatened to rape both male and female detainees using body parts and objects. They also threatened violence, including sexual violence, against detainees' female family members.
SEBIN's highest level authority, the Director General, held significant power within the agency as a whole and in El Helicoide. The Director General had a direct line of command on the heads of all substantive line directorates, including those implicated in human rights violations and crimes. He has command and control over his subordinates and is aware of what takes place in El Helicoide and elsewhere. He was responsible for violations carried out by subordinates. As detailed above, the mission received information that the General Director in turn received orders from politicians at the highest level of the Venezuelan government, including President Maduro and Diosdado Cabello. The Director General had the power to order detentions without judicial orders and to determine which individuals would be detained or tortured. The mission also received information of the Director General on occasion taking part in interrogations of prisoners without the presence of lawyers, particularly in high-profile political cases.
The information gathered for this report and the mission's previous investigations shows that the acts of violence documented were not conducted by random and unconnected individuals acting alone within the SEBIN and the HESIM. Rather, the mission has concluded that these violations, which, as noted, amount to crimes against humanity, were part of a deliberate policy by the government to silence, discourage, and quash opposition to the government. President Nicolás Maduro, supported by other high-level authorities, stand out as the main architects in the design, implementation, and maintenance of a machinery with the purpose of repressing dissent.
To arrive at this conclusion, the mission has analyzed consistent information, including from former DGCIM and SEBIN employees at the highest level, indicating the following. Number 1, the President and other high-level authorities participated in coordination meetings and thereafter directly ordered actions to be taken against specific targets by the 2 intelligence agencies. Number 2, the targeting of victims of a specific profile or their relatives, which included persons that had criticized the government, persons who achieved prominence or represented a particular threat to the government, or persons who participated in alleged attempt coups to oust the government. Number 3, arrests were preceded by periods of orchestrated intelligence activities, including surveillance, wiretapping, and electronic monitoring operations. Number 4, in several cases, the HESIM and SEBIN cooperated with other military and police forces, which potentially implies a higher level of political coordination. Number 5, arrests and detention by the HESIM and SEBIN were marked by serious irregularities, including the use of luring tactics, deliberate attempts by state officials to mask their identities, the fabrication or planting of evidence, and the use of excessive force during arrests, generating fear and a sense of helplessness. Number 6, the provision of the material, logistical support, and human resources necessary for security and intelligence operations, which evidences the involvement of authorities at the highest level. Number 7, the systematic use of cruel methods of torture against detainees and attempts of coerce detainees into making false admissions and providing information. Number 8, manipulation of the justice system to facilitate arbitrary arrests and other violations, as well as to shield intelligence officers from prosecution. Number 9, officials engaging in torture were promoted and or rewarded through other means. And number 10, frequent public statements by senior government officials on individuals arrested, either before, during, or shortly after the arrests, which indicates the existence of a common plan.
The SEBIN and the GESIM are staffed and structured in such a way as to ensure that orders by high-level authorities to carry out crimes and violations would be followed with virtually automatic compliance. The mission, therefore, finds with reasonable grounds to believe that the president and high-level state officials that supported him, identified in the mission's detailed findings, should be subjected to judicial investigations for their responsibility with regards to the crimes and violations committed through the DGESIM and SEBIN officials.
Since its first report in 2020, the mission called attention to the human rights violations within the Arco Minero del Orinoco region, hereinafter Arco Minero, as one of the situations requiring further investigation within the mission's mandate. Since then, the situation in the Arco Minero region has been subject to growing concern by international and regional human rights bodies. In 2020, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights presented a report that focused on the labor exploitation and high levels of violence committed by criminal groups that control mining in the area.
Bolívar, located south of the Orinoco River, is the largest state of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The state is home to the traditional territories of 16 indigenous peoples and large protected areas, and is rich in strategic minerals, notably gold, diamond, coltan, and bauxite. Illegal and small-scale gold mining have been historically common in the region, along with concessions to transnational companies. Illegal mining has continued to expand in recent decades due to the rise of international gold prices and the economic and humanitarian crisis in the country. Since the mid-2000s, criminal groups known as pranes or sindicatos began expanding across Bolívar state, controlling mining areas and transport routes.
The creation of the Arco Minero del Orinoco attracted massive migration from other parts of the country to Bolívar state. While the government's stated plans to attract foreign capital through public-private partnerships have not fully materialized, the sindicatos and other criminal groups have continued to expand, gaining control over entire mining areas and neighboring towns. Bolívar state has become increasingly militarized through the deployment of additional army units, coupled with the FAM's own growing economic involvement in the mining sector, such as through the Compañía Anónima Militar para las Industrias Mineras, Petrolíferas y de Gas. These dynamics have resulted in unprecedented levels of violence in Bolívar state, which in 2021 ranked as the third most violent state in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Three of the main mining municipalities of the state, El Callao, Sifontes, and Rocio, were among the 5 most violent in the country in 2021.
The mission received information to the effect that state security forces and armed criminal groups have committed and continue to commit killings, kidnappings, torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and sexual and gender-based violence, notably against residents and workers of the mining areas in Bolívar state. Illegal groups are heavily armed and routinely enter into violent conflicts among themselves or with state authorities. The mission also received information from sources with inside knowledge and eyewitnesses pointing to the collusion of some state authorities and criminal groups operating in certain mining areas, and that authorities often fail to investigate or punish the crimes committed by those groups. The mission received information indicating that criminal groups exert de facto control over large mining areas of Bolívar state through violent incursions into the mines, illegal checkpoints, sometimes located near military checkpoints, extortion, and a system of rules enforced through corporal punishment, such as public beatings, amputations, and murder. Criminal groups have also engaged in violent territorial battles with rival groups that resulted in deaths and injuries of unarmed civilians. The mission has also received information that the National Liberation Army, ELN, a guerrilla group from Colombia, has had an intermittent presence in various mining areas in Bolívar state since at least 2018.
Although most of Gran Sabana municipality falls outside of the official Arco Minero region, it is of strategic interest to both state and non-state actors as it is a key hub for air and land transport and is rich in mineral resources, mostly located on indigenous territories. As a result, as mining activity across Bolívar state has increased, so has the traffic of arms and illicit goods through Gran Sabana, as well as violent incursions by state and non-state actors vying to gain access to this area. Several indigenous leaders have been threatened or attacked by state and non-state actors. Indigenous leaders who have prevented the passage of smuggled goods or access to mines in their territory or who have opposed the armed presence of the state in indigenous territories have been particularly targeted.
There are indications that sexual and gender-based violence may be largely underreported in Bolívar state, including with respect to marginalized groups such as indigenous and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and intersex LGBTI persons. This conclusion is based on factors such as lack of state reporting mechanisms, fear of reprisals, and social stigma. Nevertheless, the mission was able to gather information indicating that sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and sexual exploitation, are commonplace in Bolívar state, particularly against women and girls perpetrated by state actors and armed criminal groups. In almost all of the mines in Bolívar state, there is a place where sexual services can be bought, colloquially known as currutelas. Most of the premises are run by private individuals under the authorization and protection of members of a sindicato. According to information received by the mission, women and girls are at times coerced into sexual relations through abuse of power, threats of violence, and at times recruitment under false pretenses, as well as restrictions on their freedom of movement, which provide indicia of trafficking in human beings and of sexual slavery.
The mission received information that within mining areas, if a sindicato member wants to have sex with someone, this person cannot refuse or denounce the commission of rape, lest being beaten or killed. Women who do not obey demands of sindicato members or other men are often subjected to specific punishments, including rape or other forms of sexual violence, cutting their hands against their will, or disfiguring their faces or scalp. Several witnesses spoke to the mission about children, mostly girls between the ages of 11 and 17, engaging in prostitution in numerous mining areas across Bolívar state between 2016 and 2022, which would constitute sexual exploitation and/or enforced prostitution. In some cases, witnesses described seeing members of security forces in currutelas where girls were being exploited.
The mission also received information and direct testimonies about sexual violence at checkpoints and border control posts across Bolívar state. Women and girls have reported sexual violence by agents of the Bolivarian National Armed Forces working at checkpoints and armed actors controlling transport routes. In order to corroborate these findings in individual cases, according to the mission's standard of proof, reasonable grounds to believe, the aforementioned allegations require additional investigation.
What you just heard is only part of the conclusions of the investigation carried out by the experts of the International Independent Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This report evidenced once again the systematic violation of human rights in our country, and on this particular occasion, the responsibility of high-level institutions and officials in committing these crimes.
We want to take advantage of this space to express our appreciation to the experts of the fact-finding mission and mainly to the victims, witnesses, non-governmental organizations, human rights defenders, and insiders who continues to make visible and denounce this reality to guarantee that justice is done and there is reparation for the victims.
And remember, if you like this special episode, share it with your friends, colleagues, or family. And in case they don't speak English, you can also find the Spanish version on your favorite platform. Well, this has been all for today. We hope that soon you can hear us again in a new episode of Venezuela 101.